Welcome to today's report. You are listening to the account with a news summary for day 372 of the war in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me again. Today I have two extra segments for you. The first one is about the Russian missile attack on Zaporizhzhia, and the second one is about the events that unfolded inside Bryansk Oblast, Russia. The rest of the updates are grouped into the usual situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, containing additional info on the A-50 aircraft that was attacked in Belarus, and the international developments. But as usual, before we start the report, the flashpoints along the front. Crimea. Ukrainian defenders continue to repel attacks around Crimea. As the Russian offensive is grinding on slowly here without any significant success, it seems Russia has decided to redeploy some units to reinforce the Vuhledar offensive instead. Bakhmut. Nothing significantly has changed here since yesterday. However, I wanted to mention this article. According to the article, the defense forces in Bakhmut, where the Russian occupiers have been trying to encircle the Ukrainian troop group since the summer of 2022, are fighting what is left of the Wagner PMC and against at least 2 battalions of Russian paratroopers. To start the news segment, the updates on the Russian missile attack on Zaporizhzhia. During the night, Russian missiles hit an apartment block in the city of Zaporizhzhia. So far, the casualties are reported as 4 dead, 11 rescued, and 20 evacuated. Another 10 residents are reported as missing. President Volodymyr Zelensky promised the ones responsible will be held accountable. Moving on to the events that unfolded inside Bryansk Oblast, Russia. The governor of Russian Bryansk Oblast bordering Ukraine reported that allegedly a Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance group infiltrated into the oblast, took civilians hostage and fired at a car. The General Staff of Ukraine commented on the events, saying Ukraine does not conduct combat operations outside Ukrainian territory. Mikhailo Podolyak, the advisor to the head of the president's office, called the accusations a deliberate provocation, a Russian classic. Meanwhile, Andriy Yusov, a representative of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, said the events are not the beginning of a civil war, but he expects similar events may take place in the near future as more Russians get involved in the liberation of their country. The Russian Volunteer Corps declared that it was not a Ukrainian reconnaissance and sabotage group, but their own soldiers who entered the territory of the Russian Federation on March 2nd to show that free Russian people with weapons in their hands can fight against Putin's regime. Russian President Vladimir Putin cancelled his visit to Stavropol due to the events in Bryansk Oblast. A look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. The Ukrainian intelligence reported that Russia is purposely creating tensions around Moldova and the non-recognized Transnistria, firstly to divert attention from the war in Ukraine, and secondly to demonstrate at least some kind of victory for the Russian people. Oleksiy Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine, has held a meeting with the ambassadors of the group of 7 G7 countries with the participation of his newly appointed deputies, where he spoke about efforts in the fight against corruption. President Volodymyr Zelensky signed the decree appointing Roman Mrochko as head of the Kherson City Military Administration. During his evening address, President Zelensky said that the winter was very hard for Ukraine and every citizen felt it. However, Ukraine was still able to provide everyone with electricity and heat. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. Allegedly, 2 UAVs have attacked a military base in the Saki district of occupied Crimea during the night. Not much information is available about this event. Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, reported today that after a 3-week delay, the expert team was finally allowed to conduct a rotation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. According to the Russian Defense Ministry magazine Voenaya Misl, Russia is developing and preparing a new type of military operation to counter US aggression, including the use of nuclear weapons. The Belarusian partisans, who claim to have damaged a Russian A-50 aircraft in Zaporizhzhia on February 26, released a video of a drone that landed unimpeded on the aircraft's radar station, despite the Belarusian authorities' claims that the airfield was being protected. Belarus once again claimed that the A-50 plane is fine and even escorted Lukashenko's plane for a little while. However, Belaruski Hayun reported that the airplane actually flew to Taganrog, Russia, for repairs. An updated estimate of the number of those mobilized in Russia during the active period of mobilization, September and October 2022, is more than 527,000 people. During the recording, reports came in that an explosion occurred in the Russian city of Koloma, Moscow Oblast. It is not yet known what exactly happened. The powerful explosion was heard in the suburbs of Koloma, a city just over 100 kilometers from the Russian capital Moscow. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have met for the first time since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The meeting lasted only 10 minutes, and Blinken stressed that the US is committed to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Meanwhile, the US State Department said that the Russian Federation and China were isolated among the G20 countries regarding the issue of the war in Ukraine. Anita Anand, Minister of National Defense of Canada, is quoted as saying that her country has sent more than 3,500 tons of military aid to Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that Russian President Vladimir Putin is not ready to negotiate, and Russia is still counting on a military victory in Ukraine. He further stated that Ukraine would receive additional Gepard self-propelled guns and Iris-T systems, which will protect Ukraine against Russian air and missile strikes. The representative of the National Security Council of the White House, John Kirby, announced during a press briefing that tomorrow on March 3rd, the US will announce a new package of military aid to Ukraine. And now for the intelligence reports, starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defense. As Ukrainian forces continue their defense of Bakhmut, Donetsk Oblast, rising temperatures are now creating the muddy conditions known in Ukrainian as Zaporizhzhia, limiting cross-country movement, CCM. Poor CCM typically provides some military advantage to defending forces. Daytime soil temperatures have risen and are now largely above freezing. As experienced since mid-February 2023, overnight freeze and daytime thaw remains likely until next week. Forecast warmer than average conditions for the remainder of winter and spring will further reduce CCM. It is almost certain that by late March, CCM will be at its worst following the final thaw. This will add further friction to ground operations and hamper the off-road movement of heavier armored vehicles, especially over churned-up ground in the Bakhmut sector. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. Agreements between the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko and Chinese leader Xi Jinping may allow Russia to receive aid from China, bypassing sanctions, the Institute writes. Lukashenko stated that Belarus is interested in deepening cooperation with China on technological development, including the creation of joint ventures, the modernization of Belarusian enterprises with modern Chinese technologies, and trading goods and services. The Institute previously assessed that China may clandestinely transfer military or dual-use equipment to Russia via Belarus. Additionally, the researchers stated that the chairman of the Russian State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, announced that the Duma could ratify amendments to the Russian Criminal Code as soon as March 14th. Those will introduce harsher punishment for discrediting participants of what Russia calls a special military operation, including volunteers. The Russian Ministry of Defense labels irregular armed formations fighting in Ukraine, specifically the Wagner PMC, as volunteers. According to Volodin, punishment would include a fine of up to 5 million rubles, about $66,000, 5 years of correctional or forced labor, or a sentence of 15 years in prison. The researchers further assessed that the Russian occupation authorities may be attempting to further constrain the presence of the International Atomic Energy Agency at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to compel the de facto recognition of Russian ownership of the plant. Russia may also be attempting to deter a possible future Ukrainian counteroffensive by escalating threats to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. During the day, the enemy carried out 24 airstrikes on the positions of our troops and 3 missile strikes on the cities of Chernihiv Yar, Donetsk Oblast, and Zaporizhzhia. As a result of the terrorist act, residential buildings were damaged and there were victims among the civilian population. In the Kupiansk and Liman directions, the enemy conducted unsuccessful offensives near Bilohorivka and Crimea in the Luhansk Oblast and Spirne in Donetsk Oblast. In the Bakhmut direction, the enemy continues its offensive. The enemy storms the city of Bakhmut. Our defenders repelled attacks in the areas of Bakhmut, Hromov, and Ivanivske settlements of the Donetsk Oblast. The enemy continues to attack the positions of our troops in the Avdiivka and Shakhtarsk directions. He carried out unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of Kamianka, Severna, and Marinka settlements of the Donetsk region. In the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson directions, the enemy is on the defensive and, in some areas, continues to try to create conditions for the transition to the offensive. In many schools of the Kherson Oblast, the occupiers introduced mandatory so-called cadet classes starting from the first grade. For these students, wearing a uniform and additional classes on patriotic education are mandatory. Due to the shortage of teachers, pro-Russian local residents without pedagogical education are hired. Mostly they are over 50 years old. For legalization, in accordance with Russian legislation, they are automatically enrolled in the correspondence form of education at specialized universities of the Russian Federation. The enemy intensified filtering measures in the temporarily occupied territories of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson Oblasts. In particular, FSB representatives arrived in the settlements of Pishchanivka and Poima in the Kherson Oblast. Mass searches of residential premises, checking of telephones are carried out. The occupiers pay the main attention to people whose relatives left for the unoccupied part of Ukraine. And with that, the report is finished. If you're interested in any articles I mentioned and want to read up on the details, I included the links to them in the description as always. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.